Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G. Welcome back to the channel. Have you ever thought about lifting a drum part from an old tune from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, lifting that drum part, isolating it, and converting the audio to MIDI? So then you can tweak the sounds and samples that you want and make that drum beat your own. Well, it sounds simple, but it's actually quite complex. And in this video, I go into great depth to explain where we are and how you can do that. Before I get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. I use chapters in all my videos to make it easy for you to find what you're looking for. This is a longer video, so if you want to skip forward to a certain part, be my guest. Also, it's unsponsored. All of the software that I use in the demo, I either own or have bought myself or downloaded a free trial. In this video, I'm going to outline 3 methods for extracting, isolating, and converting a drum track from audio to MIDI. At first you're thinking, hey, this is easy, what's the big deal? I'll find an MP3 file that captures a drummer's performance from some cover tune that I've heard before, and I want to convert that into MIDI information so that I can apply my own drum samples and make that sound my own. Well, turns out it's not that simple. Yes, there are multiple steps that you're going to need. Obviously identifying the MP3 that you want to start with, and then you're going to need potentially some artificial intelligence program that will isolate and separate the drum track from the vocal track and all the other tracks. And then you're going to drag that into your DAW, let's say Logic. And within Logic, you're going to use Flexpitch to create MIDI notes and convert audio into MIDI, and only then in the editor will you be able to apply the drum samples that you're after. So in this video, to go down that road, I'm going to cover 3 different methods. The first one is called doubling or replacing a drum part. Number 2 is going to be Flexpitch, which will convert the pitch data to MIDI. And the third is the brute force method, which really just is mimicking the drum beat in the step editor with pattern regions. I was having this dream the other night of this funky bass line, and I wanted to make a song out of it, and I didn't want to forget the idea. So when I got up in the morning, I just sort of hummed the bass line as best I could into my voice memo feature on my iPhone. And then I started searching the internet because I knew it was from a song, and I thought, is it Victor Woodham? Is it Flea? Who is it? There's some funky bass thing. Well, it turned out it was Mark King. As I thought about it a bit more, it wasn't so much the bass line I was after as much as the drum beat. So after extensive listening for about an hour, I determined it's kind of an odd song called Fashion Fever by Level 42. And the drummer is Phil Gould, who is a really good, steady funk drummer from the 80s. I thought, how am I going to go about this? First, I got to find the song, listen to the drum beat, and say, is that what I'm after? Is that the feel? Is that the groove that I want? And if it is, how do I lift that from his prior work and create my own drum beats for the song I want to create? I looked at my music library to see, do I have Fashion Fever by Level 42? I did not. So I went out to YouTube. I took the link for that and I pasted it into a utility I have called 4K Downloader. It's a great utility. You can download the entire video or just the audio. So I just downloaded the audio, and that gave me an MP3 file. I opened a new Logic project and dragged that file in, and you can see it here on track 1. So I've imported that, and one of the things I did was turn on the flex time to look at the tempo. Before I did that, I turned on the BPM. You'll see that it starts trying to calculate for this particular song. I'm going to go back to the beginning to show you. It starts off kind of varying. The interesting thing about Level 42 is that a lot of their songs are sequenced, so you'd expect them to have a consistent tempo. But with a real drummer, sometimes the drums are behind or ahead of the beat. So you can see here it comes out, it varies between 119, 120, sometimes over 120, but it looks like it was recorded generally at 120 beats per minute. Now, if you want to change that to be a consistent tempo, you turn on flex time, open up the editor, and go to Smart Tempo, and it will analyze the region. And you can do things here like changing the tempo to be constant instead of variable. And the reason you might want to do that is so that it's in sync with the metronome in Logic. If you're going to use this as your guide for creating a drum track, you want the tempo to be consistent all the time. And the tempo is displayed up here in the attributes of the Logic project. You see here I've got it consistently at 120 beats per minute. The other thing when you drag in a file is line it up with the bars and beats. You want it to be in sync with the metronome. It's really just dragging the file. So what I did here is I determined exactly where it falls on the beat by just looking at the transients. That got me to where I wanted to be. A lot of songs that you might lift, they did not play to a click track. And so the tempo is very inconsistent. You can use the Flex Tempo feature in Logic to get the tempo to a consistent beat per minute. You do that by essentially deleting all the dots in the tempo map and just dragging it to one consistent tempo that's sort of in the middle of all the dots. My next intention was going to be to program some drums. You can see over here, I just took a generic drum machine designer kit, created a track with that, and then I created some step sequencer regions. And to do that, you just right click and create a pattern region. And I tried to basically copy the drums. I was going to have to do that for every section of the song. And you'll see up at the top here, I've created markers. I essentially drew markers. Every time something changed, I gave it a name. So I said, okay, there's an intro here. Then there's the bass and drums that come into the intro. Then there's the full band that comes into the intro. Basically defines the roadmap, but it also lets me create different drums for each section. So a lot of these sections are going to be the same. So if I create a drum pattern region for verse 1, I'm going to be able to reuse that for verse 2. And you can see I called these things part A, part B, there's A again, and then this part's a bit different drum-wise, so I called it part D. And then I'm back to B. This chorus is different, so I called that part C. There's a guitar solo. I labeled all of these things to sort of give me an idea of how many of these drum regions I'm going to create. And you might say, well, why create drum regions? Why not just create MIDI? And yeah, you could. You could just key this in on the piano roll if you're good at playing drums on a pad device or on your keyboard. That's a fine way to go. At this point, it occurred to me that there are AI programs out there that will dissect and separate the tracks in this song to isolate the drums. So in order to add it, I clicked on plus, went to the Files app, and I had it stored on my iCloud drive in the download directory, Fashion Fever, right there. So I clicked on that, added it, and then it did its processing. Came back like this. And that's pretty good. It separated the drums reasonably well. And I thought, just having a separate drum track might make it easier for me to replicate the sounds. I like the sounds that Level 42 had. It's real acoustic drums, and my plan is to, program my own kit. But just looking at this app, I signed up for Moises a long time ago. I only have a free account, but it's pretty good. It's got the chord progression at the top there. I guess if you wanted to just hear some of the other parts, that's pretty handy. So I'm going to download separate tracks as MP3. I'm going to export those, save them. I'm often copying drum patterns from bands I like or old things that I've heard from the 80s that I think might be a good drum part to use on a new song that I'm working on. And that's the process I went through here. And then I thought, hey, this could really shorten my effort just by making it very clear what the drum part is. Here they are down below. I'm just going to solo the drum track so you can hear what I got back. If you use the paid-for app, you can get further separation, and the quality of these things is not great, but for free, this was like a fast way just to isolate the drums. So here we are in Logic, and we've got two tracks. We've got the original source track, which was an MP3, and we've got a track that isolates the drums. So here's the drums. And you would think, okay, that's got to be better to work with that if you're trying to copy the drums than the original track, because the original track has the melodics and harmony and everything else on it. So the easiest technique you could apply here is just to create a double track. So I've got the drum track highlighted. I go up to track, choose replace or double the drum track. And there's some options here. I want to basically copy the snare from that track, and I can control the threshold for how many snare beats are likely to show up. It will create a MIDI track for you. So let's just give that a try. And you'll see down here in this track now, it's gone to the library and assigned it a snare sound so that we can hear it. Here's what it sounds like. Now that does not sound like the snare to me. That sounds like it's picked up on another track, like the kick. And that's kind of the problem, is if you look at the transients, it is picking up the kick drum as well as the snare. We could try that again and reduce the sensitivity to get fewer beats. But let's just try adding one more. Pick our source track, again, the drum beat, go track, replace or double, and we're gonna try and double the kick this time. Now, how Logic determines which transients are kick and which are snare is a bit of a mystery to me. You know, you can have it automatically assign the MIDI notes to a note, or you can pick something like, say, C1, and that way all of the kick notes will be on C1. So let's just try that. Just by looking at it, it's picked up the kicks very much the same way it picked up the snares. So it's having difficulty differentiating a kick from a snare. Looking at the pattern, you can see this process, which is the simplest way to convert audio to MIDI, didn't work very well. At least it didn't work very well for me. Trying this again, rather than use the isolated drum track, I went back to the original MP3 thinking maybe the transients for the snare are a little bit better defined. The replace or double track feature I've set to snare, and I'm playing around with the threshold. You can see if I press the threshold this way, I see too many hits in here. I know the snare is much less than this. So see, if I go too far, I get no MIDI notes. Okay, what I've got right there, that looks about right to me. That's kind of what I expect. Okay, and then isolate this track, see what we get. I think I'm still getting too many hits. Yeah, all of these snare hits in the middle here are too many. But even though you can play around with the threshold, it really depends on the source file that you're starting with. If you have a really clean source file where the drums are nicely isolated and the transients can be read, this method may get you what you want. But in my case, I'm just getting too much interference from the song overall. Okay, I'm going to give this one more try. This time, instead of starting with the MP3 file, I'm going to start with the isolated drum track. Okay, so we're going to use this as our source. Go up to track, choose replace or double the drum track. So this below is the MIDI track that's being created. And we're trying to create a snare. I'm just going to close the library so you can see a little bit better. And playing with the sensitivity, you can see if I move it to the left, I've got way too many snare hits. It's picking up basically every kick as well as the snare. That looks like, it's picking up a snare hit there. Okay, I think it needs to be a little bit more sensitive. We'll just click OK. And now let's just listen to how many snare hits we have here. Two. So how does that relate to the original? Nowhere's near. So there's my third try. Even though I'm playing around with the sensitivity and using different sources, Logic is having a difficult time differentiating snare hits from the hi-hat and the kick. The second method that we would like to try is to convert all of the transient information to MIDI notes based on pitch. To do that, we select the track we want to use as our source and we turn on Flexpitch. Make sure that we've assigned it to Flexpitch. When we look at the file, it will have converted all of the audio information into individual pitches. To make sure you can see that, you have to turn on Flex within the edit window and make sure this is assigned to Flexpitch as well. Now there is a pitch correction option here. I turn that up to 100%. And then under Edit, I want it to create a MIDI track from the Flexpitch data. Now this is going to depend on how Logic determines the pitch of every part of that drum beat. Remember, this is a complete drum beat, not just one drum. The first thing you'll notice is that I have a lot of MIDI notes, way more than I'm expecting. I'm really only expecting a handful of drum parts, but what I've got is quite extensive. That's problematic because a lot of these things aren't even assigned to a drum sound. So down here I've got, all of these notes that aren't assigned to anything, a kick or hi-hat or anything. And if you kind of zoom in, cleaning this up and assigning it to individual drum parts would be quite tedious. The other thing you'll notice is that all of the MIDI notes came in with velocity set to a very low value. So to fix that, select all, and then holding down the Option key, increase the velocity. And if I listen to that particular track, I'm not hearing much because so many of the notes are not assigned to a particular drum. But the cleanup effort would be quite large. And then there's this big question about, well, what are all these notes up here? Do I just delete them? Are some of them hi-hat? What are they? And that's a lot of work. So trying to convert all the audio to MIDI notes of a drum kit in a polyphonic instrument, and it isn't polyphonic, but it's drums with multiple parts, has its limitations. It's not going to get me to where I want to be, where we have Flexpitch turned on. And just take a look at the Flexpitch data. You'll see there's a lot of MIDI notes that are being determined for even the simplest part of that drum beat. And it's all over the map. It's determined, oh, there's a note with a particular pitch up on this A. It isn't very consistent. It's a bit difficult. And so you can understand that Logic is having a tough time determining a consistent pitch from a drum beat as a source. If you have a very simple melodic instrument like a piano, it's going to have an easier time. It's going to hear, oh, that is a D, that's a C, that's an E. And the Flexpitch is going to pick up on what those notes are, and it'll convert that to MIDI and everything would be great. But for drums in particular, drums make it difficult to determine pitch. Even hitting a snare drum, there are multiple pitches in that drum. There's the initial hit, there's the ring of the drum and the head of the drum, which could spawn different pitches. And that's what's creating all of this data. So trying to convert all of that pitch information from a drum track to MIDI is instantly problematic. Given that Logic has such difficulty in isolating the pitch of a drum beat or the individual pitches, one strategy you could deploy is to try and isolate the pitch of each and every drum. So rather than one track of the entire drum beat, you could create multiple tracks, one for snare, one for kick, one for hi-hat. And you could use some of the tools to limit the frequencies, which ultimately would create less pitches. So let's just listen to this again. Okay, in that example, we're hearing everything. Now if I turn on EQ, I'm trying to use the EQ to limit just the kick. Another option is to use the noise gate. So what I've done is I've enabled the cutoff, high cut and the low cut frequency, and I've played with these sliders to isolate just the snare. But you can see even with that, I'm still getting kick, snare, kick, snare. But that sounds like a lot of work. And I'm not sure that gets me that far. I suppose if you develop some expertise with how to isolate the individual frequencies of a drum on a given drum track, it might pay off. This next method isn't elegant by any stretch, but it involves basically looking at the drum beat and programming a similar beat using pattern regions. So to do that, you can right click on the area you want to create a pattern region, click on the pattern region, and you can specify the length of the pattern. I'm going to make it 64 steps. Now I can start that drum beat from scratch by just clicking on where I think those beats might be. Or in this case, maybe the more efficient way is, because I already got started with this, is I can just copy the last pattern that I've created into this new area. And it's easier actually to modify this as I'm listening to the other beat to say, okay, what's in here and what's missing. So I'm looking at the pattern, but I'm listening to the source. That's a pretty effective way. You can obviously change all the sounds of each one of the kit pieces because I'm using Drum Machine Designer. If I pull up Drum Machine Designer, you'll see I've got pad controls where I can adjust things like the amount of reverb and the amount of volume for any given thing. So if I want the snare to be louder, I can just turn up the volume here or add reverb. Okay, how does that all pan out? Well, it's a little bit tedious, but it's not unbearable really. And if you look at the song as a whole, you can get pretty close. So the original sounds like this. And my copy sounds a bit like this. I'm missing the flam on the snare at the beginning. If you get, say, into this section up here where it's got kind of the main beat, we can compare. Here's what the original sounds like. Here's my copy. Here's the original again. So it's pretty close, and you can program each one of these patterns. Once I've created a part for, say, verse part A, made up of these two pattern groups, I can then just copy that for, say, verse 2 or verse 3. So a lot of cutting and pasting, but it does take quite a bit of time, especially if you got some unusual parts. So for example, at the beginning of the song, there is sort of a drum and bass intro back here. It starts right in here, and you can see it doesn't start right at the beginning of the pattern. Here's what it sounds like. Here's my version. I guess you would call this the brute force method, but it does work. And by having that drum track isolated from the original MP3, it's much easier to hear the individual parts that are going to make up the programmed drum. And this is really what I'm after, is to get the groove and the feel of the original drum part, the performance, let's say, into MIDI. And then once it's in MIDI, I can use Drum Machine Designer to assign whatever samples I want to the various drum kit pieces, and I can modify them with all the parameters on any given kit piece. Well, if you've made it to the summary by now, you've realized that out of those three methods, there's some problematic issues. As it turns out, today there's really only two methods of converting audio to MIDI. One is based on transient analysis, and the other is based on pitch. And the two work separately, but not at the same time. So if you're converting a single drum track, like a kick or a snare, the transient analysis works fine because it starts with the assumption that the transients are all for that specific drum, and all it's picking up is the timing and placement of those beats. The pitch analysis is a little bit more complex. It's been around for a while and it's built into a lot of different software packages, but it has its limits. It's not inherently polyphonic, so it can identify individual notes and convert those to MIDI, but it has trouble with polyphonic lines and chord. There is chord detection built into other products like Scalar and some others, but so far that hasn't gotten to the point where you can take a complex melodic line, perhaps something with keyboards and brass and all of those parts, and decipher all the MIDI notes. I think the next big breakthrough is really going to come from AI by taking it to the next level. It's more than just transient and pitch analysis. We have to somehow encapsulate the intelligence around drum beats. For example, you know that snares are going to be on 2 and 4 or 1 and 3, and there's going to be flams and fills and rolls that include the snare. And a kick is going to be on 3, or it could be on 1 and 3, and it may have some complex patterns to it too. 8th note pattern or a 16th note pattern is often going to be hi-hat. We need the intelligence of all those rules around drum beats built into an AI app. And I don't think that's really happened yet, and it hasn't been incorporated into a DAW or a third-party plugin or VST yet. But I can see it coming. So that combination of features built into a digital audio workstation, DAWs of the future, plus AI is probably going to get us to a better place when it comes to isolating and extracting a drum beat and converting it to MIDI. Could you use samples? Should you use samples? Of course, lots of people do, and that's going to continue on as well. But that doesn't give you the MIDI notes that you need to make that beat your own. Now, everything that I demoed in Logic matches up with what Apple promises. They explain the limitations of these technologies. The conversion of audio to MIDI works best with single drum tracks or with simple melodic patterns. They don't make any promises beyond that, really. Now, in the process of doing this video, I came across a lot of other software that could help in the process. One of them is called RipX. I downloaded it and tried it, and I think it is a much better AI separation tool for isolating the individual tracks from an MP3, something you might want to take a look at. Also, there are tools in the Izotope series of products that will help you analyze and decipher parts within a MP3 source file, maybe a cover song, where you can do more to isolate the vocals, and maybe that technology can be applied to also isolating the drums. I haven't gone too far with that yet, but I'm still going to be working on it. Now, if this content is thought-provoking, something that you're interested in, click on the like button and let me know that this video was helpful. Leave your comments. I'm very interested to hear your opinions, and subscribe to the channel because that helps me keep doing what I'm doing. If you click on the notification bell, you'll get notified when I have further videos on this topic. Thanks for watching.